for joining Woke Sessions, where we're helping you to improve yourself and your impact in the world by connecting you to woke info. And today we have the honor of learning from someone who is aiming to be the first Latino on the Wisconsin Supreme Court. He's the son of a Mexican immigrant and was president of the Wisconsin Hispanic Lawyers Association. He also founded the Latino Community Center, which served at-risk youth and helped reduce the school-to-prison pipeline. He's been an advisor to senators, Supreme Court justices, and a national resource for the Obama administration. He has always fought for working families, women, immigrants, and the LGBTQ community, and has a proven history of serving the poor and underprivileged. Mr. Ed Fallone, welcome.
Hi, Eric. Thanks to you and to your listeners for being here.
Wonderful, wonderful. So we'll jump right into it. Why are you running for Supreme Court?
Well, I'm running for the Wisconsin Supreme Court because I believe we need a greater diversity of life experience and a greater diversity of legal experience represented on the court. You did a very nice job of talking about my background, my experience. And I can tell you, I would bring a perspective, someone who stood up for civil rights, someone who's been in our communities trying to improve access to justice for working families and immigrants. I bring that perspective to the court, and I don't think it's present. I think we have a state Supreme Court right now in Wisconsin that is all white, overrepresented with former prosecutors and trial judges, and not enough voices from across the spectrum of the legal profession and across the spectrum of our life experiences.
We need that close perspective. I think the closer you can get to those you're serving, the better results you'll get. So I'm appreciating that. Now, our next question is, why are you the best choice for the Wisconsin Supreme Court? I feel like you've answered some of that already, but would you mind just elaborating?
Well, I have the legal experience and really some depth of experience. I was a criminal defense lawyer in practice. It's been 10 years since we have a justice on our state Supreme Court who actually represented the accused and the rights of the accused in our criminal system. And I'm a constitutional law professor. I write about and teach the Constitution every day. And I've been doing that for over 25 years. And so that gives me a breadth of understanding when it comes to issues like equal protection under the law, our First Amendment rights, the separation of powers, and the role of the court in overseeing the political branches of government. So it's really the depth of experience I bring as well. And I think that makes me very qualified. As you mentioned, I was asked by Senator Herb Kohl to help him prepare for 4 United States Supreme Court nomination hearings. So I'm recognized as someone who's expert in the Constitution. And I think that, it never hurts to have an expert on the court.
in many, many different ways. It never hurts. This is, having that expertise and that experience, it speaks for itself. And I want people who are tuning in to know that they're learning from someone who knows what they're talking about and who teaches others who carry a lot of responsibility. So you've taught judges and lawyers, and it's an honor to be learning from you.
Oh, well, that's nice of you to say. I think, I've had over 2,300 members of the Wisconsin Bar come through my classroom over the years. And I think it is, when you teach a subject, you have really understand that subject. Yeah. And so sitting on the bench, I won't be relying solely on the briefs of the parties or the arguments being made by the people in the case or their lawyers. I have a base of knowledge. I know the principles I believe in, and I think that will be very useful as I sit on the court.
So what is the role of a Supreme Court judge, and how does that differ from a legislator?
Well, it's an interesting question. The role of the judge is really to interpret the law. And that can be the Constitution, which sets up our basic framework of government and protects our basic rights. Or it could be a statute passed by the legislature that creates a new right or requires a new obligation of the people. Anytime that you put into writing a principle, whether it's, the right of free speech shall not be infringed by the government, or it's, you shall not put more than a certain percentage of pollutants into the air. Anytime you put into writing a command, there's always going to be questions about how does that command apply to specific factual situations? What is the reach of that command? So that's really the job of the court, not to write the command from scratch, but to define it, explain it, and make sure that people follow it.
So the command or the law is what's created by the legislatures, and the judges are the ones who interpret and apply that in real life situations.
That's right. That's right. And of course, you and your listeners are thinking, yes, but the power to interpret could be misused as the power to rewrite the law.
Exactly.
And of course, that's where we get into these debates over the role of the courts in our country, is, whether judges are going too far and they are actually taking advantage of their position to rewrite the laws to their making. I can tell you that I'm a very strong believer in judicial restraint, which is the principle that judges should avoid deciding major constitutional questions if at all possible, and that way prevent having the temptation to rewrite the law or rewrite the Constitution. And so I think we should try to leave it to the legislature. That's democratic self-government. Those are our representatives we elect. They should be the ones. They should be the ones making it. Of course, judges have to be vigilant. The legislature majority. We can't let the majority trample on the rights of the minority. So it's just a fine line, Eric.
Ed, how do you manage or overcome bias? Because what you're talking about is basically the temptation to, overreach or encroach on areas that judges should not be involved in. So how do you, especially for the listeners, how do you overcome bias, and how do you teach your students to do the same?
Well, I think, as I suggested, you begin with an approach of humility. Recognize you don't have all the answers. Sometimes people put the black robes on and they think all of a sudden they've become, super geniuses.
The law, yeah, right.
Yeah, and then you have to have an open mind and give the parties in the case their fair opportunity to make their best argument. I mean, don't prejudge a case. Sit back. The lawyers are being paid to make the best possible argument for their client, give them their shot. And then, there's the structural thing, which is, as much as I try to be open-minded and humble, I'm only human.
Yeah.
But in a 7-member court, if we can have a variety of judges with a variety of backgrounds, that's where, hopefully you don't get that groupthink. You don't get basic assumptions. I could give you an example if you want.
Yeah.
But if you have a variety of voices, someone's going to step up and say, wait a minute, that's not right. And the example is the voter ID case that was decided in the 7th Circuit in the federal court system.
Yeah.
One of the judges after the fact said, we weren't presented any evidence. We were just told that this law that required a driver's license to verify your ID to vote, we were just told it was no big deal. And none of us judges really interacted with communities that didn't have driver's licenses.
Wow.
We live in communities where everyone we know has a license. And so it wasn't until later that it really sort of occurred to that judge that there was a lot he didn't know about the access to driver's licenses, people who had suspended, revoked licenses, elderly people who didn't drive at all. And so that's what I mean about having more diversity. You got 7 seats on our state Supreme Court. The more backgrounds you have, the less likely the court will make a mistake and make some kind of an assumption that's not merited.
Yeah, it's kind of like you don't know what you don't know, but knowing that can hopefully help to mitigate bias and get some more opinions to the table.
That's right. Right.
And so one of the things that I'm really curious about is the dilemmas that judges must come up against ethically, especially if you're dealing with a situation that's either close to the heart or that you have your own strong views about. How do you, ethical dilemmas, do they happen? How do you handle them?
Well, I think there are the easy ethical dilemmas and the hard ones. The easy ones are where the conflict is due to a friendship or a financial relationship with someone who's appearing before you. And I think that's very easy to have a hard and fast rule that requires the judge to just step down and recuse themselves from that case in an instance where one of the parties has either a personal relationship to the judge, or they have a past financial relationship, or maybe they made campaign contributions. We can have rules that can address those conflicts. I think the harder conflict is when a judge finds that the law leads to one answer, and that answer is the opposite of their personal preference. And that's really hard, because we all have personal preferences. We all have certain outcomes that we would like to see happen in a case, usually, especially ones that involve social issues like access to reproductive rights, or the treatment of our LGBTQ community. And if the law points in a different direction than where your heart points, then that's difficult. And I think, from my perspective, the answer is to have judges who really focus not on outcomes and winners and losers, but rather judges who have a track record of focus on principles. And so I feel that, for example, I've long been a defender of our free speech rights, and I've defended that principle. And so, without regard to who wins or loses, whether they're Democrat or Republican, or I agree with what they're saying politically, I've already committed myself in my career to defending the right of free speech. And so I think if you have judges who have a track record of acting on principle, then hopefully that will reduce the temptation to just sort of rule and follow your heart.
Having strong principles. And one of the other courses that I teach, we talked about understanding purpose over the process. And a lot of folks get really tied up in the tasks of a process that must be accomplished without understanding the purpose. So when challenges or dilemmas come up, there's a lot of confusion. But understanding your purpose, or in this case, principle, has a deeper foundation that you can stand on and lead from. You talked about free speech. How do you balance free speech and the need to control harmful speech?
Well, I think, hate speech is really the difficult issue here. I know that sometimes we have a speaker invited, say, to an academic environment, and there's a protest in counter to the speaker's views, and some people feel that we should have rules to prevent disruption of speakers. I think that that's the wrong approach. I think that the disruptors or the protesters have just as much a free speech right as the speaker. And usually, as long as there's no violence involved, there's no threat to public safety, you can accommodate both views. I think it becomes more difficult when the speech that we're protecting, hate speech, which in and of itself inflicts harm or fear on the audience. And there I do think, none of our rights in the Constitution are absolute. Not a single one of them. There's always the ability to limit our rights when it's necessary, and really there's a compelling reason to do so. And so I think when you get into hate speech, that's when you start to see if the speech is not just an expression of opinion, but actually inflicts emotional harm or fear on people, then I think we all have some responsibility and duty to make sure that we don't have people suffer that harm in that fear. So like I said, no rights are absolute. It can be difficult to know where that dividing line is. And you just have to err on the side of protecting our rights and try to allow the free discourse of ideas to play itself out.
Yeah, and it sounds like there's that principle of not causing harm, and finding ways to mitigate harm, but allow
and I think that that's really something that's been a more recent development in our nation, where sometimes groups are now getting sophisticated enough. They try to use our individual rights and liberties as a bit of a Trojan horse to allow them to accomplish socially harmful goals, to be disruptive, to spread fake news, to sow confusion or anger among people. They wrap up their strategies and their tactics in the mantle of free speech, because they know they can get past our defenses and perhaps accomplish a lot that way. And I think that's unfortunate, because it causes people to rethink their commitment to our rights.
Yeah.
When they see rights being asserted in a way that is harmful, it causes people to rethink their commitment to our rights. And I think that that's bad for our society. And I'm sorry to see that that's something that seems to be going on.
Yeah. Speaking of what is bad for our society, what's the greatest obstacle to justice today? It's a huge question, but I'm curious.
Yeah. I was going to say, how long is your podcast here?
Well, we've got 30 minutes.
One of the things that I've always been struck by is that you have different quality of justice in America, depending on what your resources are, how much money you have. I started my career representing large, major corporations, and I saw, how unlimited their funds were, how many of the best lawyers in the country they could hire on a particular case, and just throw money at a legal dispute and overwhelm the other side. And then I've seen, working families who pay their bills every month and they can't afford a lawyer. And so they go to the courthouse on their own if they get sued in a civil case, or if they're just even trying to get a divorce on their own and split their assets with their spouse. They get a far lesser quality of justice when they're left to their own devices. And so that troubles me a great deal. And so I'd say one of our biggest obstacles is to try and ensure that the amount of money that you have does not determine the quality of the justice you get in the system. I think it's important. Justice is our birthright. We all have a right to it. And I think it's important that we all have equal justice.
I appreciate that. That's it's been a concern. I think that's something that we kind of assume, just having seen enough Law and Order and enough movies where you see more money kind of tends to, it doesn't manipulate the law per se, but it certainly can have a great impact on the outcomes. And I know that discourages a lot of folks from that.
Well, yeah. As I go around the state, as a candidate for the Wisconsin Supreme Court, many people come and approach me and they share their story of their personal interaction with the justice system. And many times it's people who say, I got sued, I didn't have a lawyer, I went in, and now I'm still to this day living with the consequences of what happened in that courtroom, where I was at a huge disadvantage. I didn't know what was going on. And even years later, either this child custody was decided in a way I have to live with, or I have this ongoing recurring financial obligation that was imposed on me I can't get out of. But just how, their life was changed by a court interaction that they feel like they weren't prepared for, they weren't ready for, and that it wasn't fair.
Speaking of not being fair, as you know, Wisconsin is known as one of the most racially disparate states in the nation. What role do the courts play in this, and what changes can the court system make to reduce racial disparities, if any?
Well, I think there are things that the Wisconsin Supreme Court can do. And as a candidate, I've been talking about this. I think many of your listeners might assume that the Wisconsin Supreme Court just decides appeals of cases. So an individual's interaction in the courts, whether it's in the criminal system or the civil, that the Supreme Court just is the final word on who wins and loses. And that's a good chunk of what they do. But the court is also the administrator over the entire court system in our state. So things relating to access to our courthouses for the disabled, things related to access to justice and the fees that get paid to lawyers who represent poor people. Many aspects of the justice system are actually administrated by the courts. And so I think that when it comes to eliminating racial disparities in our system, there's three things I talk about that could help reduce it, that the court could take a lead. The first is on the criminal side. We have many pilot programs that in some counties have specialty courts where someone is brought up on criminal charges, but they have an underlying mental health issue or an underlying addiction issue. They can be referred to a specialty court to try and make sure they get treatment for what's causing their antisocial behavior. Our courts overseeing these pilot programs, I think we're ready to expand them. I think we should make it the rule and not the exception across the state. The second thing, and I give credit where it's due, the current members of our Supreme Court have recently ordered for the first time that statistics be kept on racial factors in sentencing and in charging.
Mm.
We didn't have statistics. We didn't really have hard data, for the same charge. Does it make a difference whether you're black or white or Latino in terms of whether you get charged at all, whether you are sentenced to a higher penalty? And so now for the first time, we've been keeping those statistics, and I applaud that, and I would expand that and make sure that we don't prematurely declare case closed. And then the third thing is something that efforts are underway in the state legislature, and I think the court could do a great job of being supportive of those efforts and helping them succeed. And that's in the area of expungement. With so many, larger percentage of our prison population are people of color, and when they finish their sentence, they find themselves with a criminal record that follows them around, follows them forever. And so every time they try to rent an apartment or apply for a job, that criminal record is an obstacle. And so we can have an expungement process put in place if we want. The legislature would do that. The court would need to oversee implementation, where someone who's finished their sentence could go in front of a judge, request to have their criminal record removed. And if the judge agrees that they're a good candidate for that, then the criminal record would be erased, and it would no longer be a barrier to their job prospects or their housing. So those are just three examples. Yeah, that would be a huge help in reintegrating people in our society. So those are just three examples of where I think, as a justice on the Supreme Court, I could help provide leadership and help the court system move forward.
I really appreciate you for sharing that, because it helps paint a potential solutions to some of these deep chains of the sort of the criminalization of poverty, how that leads to prison, and how that negatively impacts communities over the long haul. When you have communities who are poor communities, or typically impoverished communities, tend to be communities of color, at least in the Midwest, if you look at income disparities, and seeing that police presence is typically higher in communities of color and low-income communities, leading to higher criminal records. If those things are still on our record, and I've played a role in this myself and experienced some of this, you have to ask yourself a question at some point of, how you're going to get back on your feet. And I've been blessed to have opportunities come my way, but not everyone's been that fortunate. And so what you're talking about, I think, actually could make a difference, which also leads to another question, which is, what are some of the ways you've been able to impact the system so far?
Well, in the nonprofit sector, one of our main projects at the Latino Community Center when I was president was to have a community-based center where we could get kids off the street, where they weren't susceptible to temptations, whether they were drugs or risky sexual activity or gangs, to give them a safe place to go off the streets. I mean, we located ourselves in a community with many parents who were single parents who were working long hours. So when the children got off school, they were unsupervised. Or even there were two-parent households where both parents were working, even multiple jobs, and so weren't around as often. And that's when kids get into that school to prison pipeline. That's when they get suspended from school, and then they're on the street during the day, or even just after school, they're breaking into parked cars, and just slowly getting on, ever increasing encounters with the criminal justice system, until the next thing you know, they're in prison for a serious violation. So that's one example. This sort of early intervention, ensure that we don't wait until you see a young person in front of you as a judge. You don't wait till that moment to care what happens to them, that you started much earlier. And then again, just my efforts to lawyers, to families who have legal issues. It might be even in a rural area, a family where some member of the family got involved in opioid addiction, and that led to legal problems, and they need a lawyer. They have issues, whether it's criminal or civil, and they can't afford the lawyer. And so what do? Right? They go to the
Right.
courtroom on their own. And so trying to make sure that we have access to justice, that we provide, experienced lawyers to help families through these situations, and that people aren't left alone in the system. So those are things I've done in the nonprofit sector. And obviously that leads to an attitude of trying to make the system work better, and a belief that it's possible to make it work better, that I think as a justice on the court, I would continue to do that and be a leader in that area.
I really appreciate what you have done. And I know that has definitely caused ripples. And what I love about this is the connection to some of the most underserved and unheard voices, and being able to bring that perspective and that experience, I think, is hugely, hugely important and largely missing in our current judicial system. So thank you for that. What is your vision for the future of the judicial system? I know you touched on some of that a little bit.
Well, I have to say this, Eric. This is a campaign. I'm running to win. I'm going to win this election. I'm going to get my seat. But it's also beyond that. It's a campaign for the hearts and minds of the people of Wisconsin. I hope when this election is over, win or lose, I hope that the voters of Wisconsin start thinking about our Wisconsin Supreme Court a little differently. That we stop just sort of ignoring it and feeling like we have no stake in the game, and it doesn't matter to us which of these two people you never heard of get elected to the court. To stop looking at it that way and instead realize, we have the power. We, the people, have the power to vote for the kinds of justices with the kinds of experiences that we think can make an impactful difference in the justice system. And so if we can encourage those sorts of individuals to run and support them when they run and elect them to the court, imagine what kind of a justice system we could have if we start changing the experiences and the perspectives of the people involved in the system. So I hope that my campaign will get people thinking about our judicial elections in that way, and that maybe in the future we'll see more and more diversity on the court.
I love that. How do you deal with people who are being difficult, peers, lawyers, clients, litigants, etc.?
Well, I have a lot of experience as a board member of nonprofits, a president of organizations, as the president of the Academic Senate at Marquette University, which is a large body of about 40 members who are the governance body of Marquette. So I have a lot of experience dealing in large groups trying to reach common decisions. And I can tell you, the way to deal with it is just make sure you never make it personal. You've got to make sure you can disagree with people on principle, but you don't impugn their integrity. You don't accuse them of having some sort of a improper motive. And you don't leave them afraid that, any kind of a handshake deal that you're going to renege on it or stab them in the back later. So, that's how I try to conduct myself. I mean, obviously, you're not going to always be able to get agreement with people, but I think if you build trust, you can accomplish a lot.
This sounds like some relationship advice, Ed. I need to write this down.
Well, that's between you and your significant other, Eric. We had, when I was president of the Latino Community Center, there was some bad media, some unfortunate newspaper stories about our president relating to our executive director relating to his personal life that created a little bit of a scandal. I think when you have controversy arise, the first thing you do is you try to figure out what are the important relationships that you need to preserve and protect, because that's what controversies do, is they tend to destroy relationships that you have, because then people view you differently. So in the example of the Latino Community Center, when this bad media came out about our executive director, I immediately called all of our funding sources, the people who gave us money, and made sure they understood what the situation was and were fully informed. I spoke to the staff to make sure they understood what was going on, and also the parents of the kids who came to our center. So I made sure everyone understood that the controversy was not in any way going to change their relationship with the center and its staff. Their kids would remain safe, Nothing else would change. And you just, if you keep those lines of communication open, then the controversy will play itself out and those relationships will remain. So I think that that's the way to deal with it. Just focus on, your important relationships, talking to those people, being honest and forthright, and making sure they stand by you through thick and thin.
Right on. It sounds like when you have that clarity, it gives you some level of certainty. I think controversy invites a lot of uncertainty into our relationships and into the work that we're doing. But when you can have that transparency, I think it gives a lot of certainty, and that's in a situation where there might not be any. And then, of course, you always, like you said, stand on your principles. And I think between those two things, you're definitely on the right side, whatever side you're on.
Yeah, I think that's the word certainty you use is the right word, because controversy is really just an upsetting of people's established perceptions.
Right.
And so if you can provide them with the certainty that nothing has changed and that you're addressing any issues that have come out, then they can feel that established relationship will continue, and that, it's not necessary to rethink the entire relationship.
Thanks so much for taking the time out to teach us about the Supreme Court, about some of the challenges that judges face, and some of the needs in the judicial system. I think this is really important, and having more people aware of just what goes on here is a tool that they can use to have more impacts in the system, even if it's just supporting a candidate that they believe brings the perspectives that we need to see. So really, really appreciative.
Thank you, Eric. I've enjoyed our conversation very much.
Wonderful. Please, as you listen to this, check out the website, www.Fallone for Justice, Fallone for Justice.com. And with that, stay woke.